Hello Internet and welcome to the BoffNet Book Club's first lesson on Persuasion. Let's go right to it because we've got a lot to talk about. Volume 1 can essentially be divided into three parts, the parts at Kellynch Hall, Uppercross and Lyme. At Kellynch we're introduced to the central characters, we find out that these central characters are in financial difficulties, they rent out Kellynch to Admiral and Mrs Croft, and we learn about Anne Elliot's romantic history with Captain Wentworth. At Uppercross there's a pivotal November walk where we see Captain Wentworth returning and developing a relationship with Louisa Musgrove, but this relationship is ended in Lyme where Louisa falls off the cob and bashes her head. At the end of Volume 1, we see the characters who don't stay with Louisa in Lyme returning to Uppercross in disarray. In the last video I said that while you're reading the novel you should look at what characters read. The first thing that we see in the novel is Sir Walter Elliot, the main character's father, reading The Baronetage, which is a book that documents the ranks of the British aristocracy. The Baronetage is the only book that Sir Walter ever reads, and it soon becomes clear why. He likes to look at what's written about other members of the landed gentry and compare it to what's written about him. As well as what's originally written, Sir Walter also adds the details of his youngest daughter's marriage into the book. Sir Walter is the embodiment of vanity and persuasion. You'll have seen just from reading Volume 1 that he's obsessed with people's ranks and looks, so it's interesting to think that the person who he's actually vaguely romantically involved with, Mrs Clay, isn't a person of nobility, and she isn't even very attractive. She has freckles and a protruding jaw. Mrs Clay goes against everything that Sir Walter stands for, and so it's important to consider why Sir Walter is romantically involved with her and not somebody of a higher social standing, or at least somebody who's more attractive. Also, while we're talking about the Baronetage, Sir Walter's eldest daughter Elizabeth, even though she's just as vain as her father, can't stand the sight of it. Whenever she finds it open on a table, she has to close it and push it away from her because she can't stand to see written evidence of the fact that her youngest sister has got married and she hasn't. Both of her younger sisters have been proposed to. Mary's even got married, but Elizabeth has never actually received any more than vague attentions from one person, and that's William Elliot. And if you've got further than Volume 1, you'll know that William Elliot is not the kind of person you want attentions from. Also, something that I find really interesting is the fact that The Baronetage is Sir Walter's favourite book, even though it documents the death of his wife. The narrator of the novel tells us that Lady Elliot was an excellent woman, and that while she was alive, she had to do everything in her power to cover up her husband's failings. Something to look at in Volume 2 is the way in which Anne reacts to being told by Mrs Smith how she was treated by her late husband. It's little things like this that make Sir Walter more than just a foolish spendthrift baronet, and turn him into a character who's much more three-dimensional and actually psychologically very interesting. Something else that we talked about in the last video was Jane Austen's representation of the Navy. Sir Walter Elliot hates the Navy because it brings people of indistinct birth into undue distinction. Because the English language is limited to words and not punctuation, I'll have to use these as my quotey hands. High-ranking naval officers don't get entered into the Baronetage. They get entered into the naval lists, the other form of literature in the novel that's very important. Unlike the Baronetage, the naval lists document achievement and not just rank, so the one that characters choose to get their information from is a good indicator of their moral standing. Sir Walter Elliot is just one example of characters forming prejudices against the Navy for the wrong reasons. Yes, I know what you're thinking, and the answer is yes, it is a different t-shirt. Also, it is now dark outside, so I've turned the lights on. Even though we get negative stereotypes about the Navy in Persuasion, Jane Austen turns us against them by her presentation of the naval characters, and you can see it best in Admiral and Mrs Croft. The Crofts have what we might call an ideal marriage. Admiral Croft calls Mrs Croft by her first name, they're always together, and if you look at the scene in the carriage with the Crofts, Mrs Croft has to take the reins to stop Admiral Croft running foul of a post. This is a good example of how their relationship is run in general. Mrs Croft has an equal footing in it. If you look at the scene in the White Hart Inn in Volume 2 where Mrs Croft is talking about mutual attachment, she gets interrupted by Mrs Musgrove. The Musgroves don't have a mutual marriage. Mrs Musgrove talks a hell of a lot in the novel compared to Mr Musgrove, who says literally nothing. We haven't even started to talk about Anne or Wentworth yet, and there's a whole lot more that we could say about Volume 1, so we'll have to charge through Volume 2 next week and see how we go. If you have any questions, you can leave them down there. Your homework for this week is to go away and read Volume 2, because next week we meet the Dalrymples. Internet, I'm Jonny, and this is Anne Elliot.